Few periods in the history of the United States produce as much bitterness or create such enduring controversy as the era of Reconstruction. To many white Southerners, Reconstruction is a harsh, destructive experience. But to former slaves, it is an important first step in acquiring civil rights and economic power.
The challenge for Southerners after the war was how to recover from the damage, how to reconstitute a society whose main foundation had been destroyed, and that foundation was slavery. The foundation of social relations, the foundation of the economy, the way things worked.
Once that institution's gone, at the most practical level, there's the question, who is going to do the work? Where are these people going to live, regardless of what they do for an occupation? So all of these questions had to be resolved.
The responsibility for resolving these issues, for taking steps that will encourage recovery in the South, falls to the Republicans.
The Republicans, in order to make Reconstruction work, had to establish themselves in states where the Republican Party was an entirely foreign presence, indeed hated. As each state was brought back into the Union, as they all were by the early 1870s, each state struggled to reform its Democratic Party and defeat the Republicans.
At first, about 1/4 of the white males are excluded from voting or holding office in the 10 southern states reorganized under the Congressional Plan. That results in a majority of black voters in 5 southern states.
And massive turnouts of black people to vote. The largest number of blacks ever elected to office in U.S. history up until the 1980s, really, were elected during the 1860s and 70s.
Every southern state had to accept black suffrage as a condition of going back into the Union. They all did, but they worked very hard to end that situation.
Suffrage limitations on white males are soon lifted. When that happens, Republicans maintain control only with the help of Southern whites.
We know about the carpetbaggers, the Northerners who came south to take advantage of the opportunities that the post-war South could offer, both in politics and the economy. We know the story of the scalawags, those Southerners who did support a Republican presence, who did want to bring progress to the South a la the North. We do know the story of the corruption of these governments as they enticed the railroad industry to come down and invest in their land, mining companies, all kinds of manufacturing plants. There was a large number of prominent people in the South who accepted the war's end, who said, let's get on with this, let's accept the fact that we lost, let's not revel in our defeat, let's look forward to progress.
There are certainly examples of graft and extravagance in Reconstruction governments, but there are also positive accomplishments, such as the dramatic improvements in Southern education.
It's only with the Reconstruction governments, the very first governments that have black representatives in them, where you get constitutions that establish public schools.
Usually segregated schools, but schools at least. And in many of the northern states, integrated schools. For the first time during slavery, it had been illegal in most of the South even to teach a black, even a free person of color, to read and write. Some of it had gone on, but it had been technically illegal.
It is clear that African Americans want a stake in Southern society. They want their own land. At first, the Freedmen's Bureau grants land from abandoned plantations to thousands of black families.
A lot of Northerners correctly believe that the South, at least in my opinion, correctly believe that they were treasonous, that they had declared war on the United States, and therefore they had no right to this land. And clearly enslaved people said, well, we've worked the land, so the land is ours. And in some cases, they set up cooperatives, and in some cases, they were able to buy some of this land. Unfortunately, most of the land went back to the former owners.
Northerners had assumed that a free labor system would emerge in which black freed people would work the way Northern wage labor worked.
What would happen is that they would work the land supposedly as wage laborers, and then they wouldn't be paid.
There's literally no money to pay wages because the entire banking system of the South has been destroyed, and there's destruction of wealth in general. So what evolved out of the absence of money was a system of sharecropping. Whites traded access to land and some of the essential agricultural tools to African Americans for a portion of the crop. And out of that, blacks and whites struggled to find some sort of common ground where the South continued to produce cotton. Blacks made a little bit, whites made a little bit, and theoretically it was a system of shared interests.
And they find themselves in debt all the time because they've worked the land, but of course they have no mules, they have no plows, they have no equipment, they have no food, so they have to buy that from the landowner, and the landowner charges exorbitant amounts of money for this. The interest rates are, there's no other way to say that it's criminal. It's usury. In some cases, the interest rates are like 80%. Obviously, at the end of the year, the sharecropper is going to be in debt. So now he's got to work the next year just to get rid of the debt that he incurred the previous year.
The only way to escape in that case was to leave at the dead of night, so load up what few material possessions you had and try to get out of county. But if you didn't make it out, then you were dragged back and existed in this sort of state of perpetual debt peonage. So it was a system that too often was highly exploitative. Another way of putting it is, nobody who was a sharecropper wanted to be a sharecropper.
One of the most striking features of the Reconstruction period is the effort of blacks to rebuild their family structures.
Suddenly they could be married. Their children were their own. They couldn't be sold away. They could move. If they didn't like the people that they were working for, if they got a bad deal, they could leave. This sort of freedom, compared to what had been the African American experience since 1619, was really extraordinary, and there was extraordinary enthusiasm and expectation of things to come. It did not all happen.
There are many instances where men come back and now they want the quote-unquote traditional lifestyle where the woman listens to the man and does his bidding. But meanwhile, she still has to work. And in many cases, she works as a sharecropper and then spends a good amount of her time working in the plot of land that is for the family economy, for, family well-being.
As much as men do not want their wives to engage in the work that reminds them of slavery, this just isn't possible for many black families.
Freedom did not bring this massive change so that now African American women could have a very traditional lifestyle where she doesn't work anymore and she gets taken care of and she gets protected. Basically, and for African American women, that's never the case. That's absolutely never the case. Men's jobs were never enough to provide for them. So the notion that if they could live the traditional female life, it's not an option for African American women, and in many ways never has been.
During the Grant administration, the North becomes increasingly preoccupied with its own political and economic problems, and interest in Reconstruction fades. In fact, by the time Grant leaves office, Democrats have redeemed 7 of the 11 former Confederate states. It is a setting in which secret societies like the Ku Klux Klan can use intimidation and violence to undermine the gains that had been made.
The defenders of the Ku Klux Klan argued that the South had devolved into utter chaos. African Americans were threatening whites' life and liberty, and that there was no one to impose order because the military governments were committed to the interest of African Americans, and so white Southerners took it upon themselves to create an organization to bring order to the South. Well, the practical reality was the Ku Klux Klan was a means of, yes, bringing order, but on the white man's terms. Simply put, the Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization used to reestablish white supremacy.
The Republican Congress tries to turn back this new wave of white repression. In 1870 and 1871, they passed two enforcement acts that allow the federal government to confront Klan efforts to restrict the vote. This is a first. Never before has government claimed the power to prosecute individual crimes under federal law.
I think it is fair to say that in 1870, 1871, there was an exertion of federal authority and an expansion of black political participation in a way that changed the direction of Reconstruction for a period of time. But by 1874, 75, 76, for a host of reasons, the national commitment to Reconstruction was waning, and white Southerners reverted to using violence and intimidation again, without the sort of umbrella of the Ku Klux Klan.
The Northern Democratic Party all along said Reconstruction is wrong. They sympathized with their Southern Democratic brethren that you have an oppressive government in Washington. So what you have in this period of the 1870s is a struggle within the Republican Party between people who said the federal government has a responsibility to try to protect these people's rights, that is the former slaves' rights, particularly the right to vote, to participate in the polity, and to do what it takes for that to happen. But a growing number of people in the Republican Party said, no, the cost is too high, that these are not really good citizens, and so it's better to have the property classes in the South retake control.
Grant plans to run for another term in 1876, but Republican leaders, shaken by Democratic gains, resist. On Election Day, his name is not on the ballot.
Samuel Tilden was the Democratic candidate for president, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for president. When the votes were counted, Hayes won most of the northern states and lost the two important states of New York and Indiana. Tilden won most of the southern states, and three states in the South were undecided, or disputed, shall we say: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The old interpretation was that representatives of Southern Democrats met with Hayes representatives in Washington and made a deal.
A deal that has Hayes removing all remaining troops from the South in exchange for support of his presidency. But not everyone agrees with this interpretation.
A half century ago, one of our most distinguished historians, C. Van Woodward, raised the question, well, Tilden would have removed the troops. That doesn't make any sense. Why would they give in to Hayes on that point? And so Woodward, in his interpretation, entered this into the mix as well. That Hayes' representatives said, well, Hayes would support internal improvements for the South, and the deal was struck.
Southern industry does expand in the years that follow.
In an effort to diversify the economy, not just be dependent on one crop, cotton, which was very problematical after the war, but expand that. Build a textile industry so you don't send the cotton up north.
The steel industry in Alabama, textiles in the Carolinas, those new jobs that provide an alternative to landowner labor are restricted to whites. Those new economic opportunities are for white people.
Some blacks, however, do manage to acquire property, establish small businesses, and enter professions. The key is education, and for a time, the major spokesman for the importance of education for his race is Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
Booker T. Washington's an enormously important figure, both for what he actually did and what he represented. It is perhaps the most extraordinary of all the American rags to riches stories. So, symbolically, he was a testament to what African Americans could do in freedom. At the same time, he built up Tuskegee as an entirely black-run institution with black faculty, black students, teaching subjects relevant to African Americans at a time when, of course, blacks could not go, at least in the South, to white institutions. And he finally articulated a vision of how it was that blacks were going to survive in an era of white supremacy. The compromises, as he saw it, was that African Americans would strive for a degree of economic autonomy, and once they had that, then white America would have to deal with them from a position of power as opposed to a position of weakness. It's not that he believed that African Americans should completely sacrifice political rights, equality, but that the first priority was that economic institutional foundation. Others, Ida Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that you couldn't separate out black aspirations. So he was being criticized from both sides.
Few white Southerners ever accept the idea of racial equality. The fact that former slaves acquire any legal and political rights at all is the result of federal support. That support all but vanishes after federal troops withdraw in 1877.
One of the things that happens with the end of Reconstruction is total disfranchisement. The 15th Amendment had given African American men the vote, but in the 1880s, the 1890s, the grandfather clauses, the white primary took the vote away, and particularly through terror, just sheer, unadulterated terror. Pogroms where you have whole villages just being uprooted and burned out.
The states started passing segregation laws in the South. And in particular, in 1890, Louisiana passed a law saying that railroads had to be segregated. And this gave rise to the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is an interesting case. Plessy was chosen because he was only 1/8 black. The lawyer who was going to try the case wanted to make a particular point in court. And so they chose someone who was very light-skinned and who could not be told from a white person if you just saw him.
Of the several test cases that are appealed, this is the only one that reaches the Supreme Court.
The decision was 7-1. One of the justices was out of the country, and the dissenter was John Marshall Harlan. The justice who'd written the opinion in the court, Henry Billings Brown of Michigan, had said that the law was equal. It prevented blacks from being in white coaches. It prevented whites from being in black coaches. Harlan knew, as Henry Billings Brown actually knew, that this was nonsense, that in fact it was meant to discriminate. And he said so in no uncertain terms. And it was a dissent which has become very important in U.S. history. Here we are in 1900. The federal attempt to protect black rights has failed because of Supreme Court decisions. The state efforts to protect black rights have succeeded in the North. In the South, there is considerable disfranchisement by constitutional amendment, and blacks are not very well off at all.
With each year that passes, the limitations on blacks seem to tighten, choking off the gains that were achieved just after the Civil War.
Violence allowed Democrats usually to take over the polls. They would stuff the ballot box and simply make up returns. Louisiana was the worst. Sometimes 125% of the people would vote, and strangely enough, they would all vote Democratic. This was in areas that were 70, 80, 90% black, where surely they were all voting Republican. And then they had a constitutional convention, and they passed laws, literacy tests, property tests, poll taxes, and other infringements on the right to vote, and that made it much more difficult for blacks to get registered. Sometimes they would pass these with exemptions for some whites, the so-called grandfather clauses, or understanding clauses, requiring that you read and understand the Constitution in order to be registered to vote. And violence, although important, really didn't manage to eliminate the black vote. It was laws that eliminated the black vote.
The 1890s, however, witness a record number of lynchings. Most of the victims are black.
The image of lynching is of frontier justice There's an absence of courts, and there are criminals that have to be punished, and so the outraged citizenry comes together and delivers rough justice to somebody who really deserves it. But in the American South, where thousands upon thousands of victims died at the hands of lynch mobs, the purposes, the function, the way in which lynching unfolded has nothing to do with that sort of mythic image of lynching. Instead, it was a brutal form of oppression intended to silence, intimidate, and terrorize African Americans, as well as a few other groups in the South that some whites believed had to be kept in their place. So there's no way to take lynching as it unfolded in the South and gussy it up and make it into something that fits in with some sort of tradition of frontier justice. It's just raw oppression.
These instances of raw oppression do not occur as frequently in some parts of the South as in others.
Wherever there was cotton cultivation, there were tensions built into labor relations that provided those sort of flashpoints for violence between whites and blacks. In Virginia, for example, where blacks had a little bit more freedom, a little bit more economic autonomy, there are fewer of those flashpoints, so that there are still lynchings, approximately 100 in Virginia, but there aren't the 500 that there were in Mississippi.
Since lynching is an illegal activity, there are few records to show just who is involved.
However, there are a variety of ways in which we can have a pretty good idea of who participated, and it ranged with the population of the white South. There were lynchings in which most of the mob members were family members of some alleged victim of crime. There were other cases when the whole cross-cut of the community, white community, would participate. So it's not as though any one group of white Southerners participated. One way of saying it is that in any given Southern community, any white Southerner could participate in a lynching. That didn't mean they always did, but they could.
The victims of lynching are as varied as the architects of the violence.
I'll use a specific example. The lynching of an African American named Sam Hose outside of Atlanta in 1899. Sam Hose originally got involved in a dispute with his white employer, defended himself, and in the process killed his attacker, his white employer. Then he fled the scene. Within a matter of days, white newspapers in Atlanta started circulating the story that he had not only murdered his employer, but then he had raped multiple times his employer's wife, beside the dead body of her husband, and had nearly dashed the brains out of her young infant child.
When Sam Hose is caught and transported back to Atlanta, the train in which he is riding passes through the town where the crime had allegedly taken place. The lynch mob is waiting.
And there were thousands upon thousands of spectators who had come from Atlanta on special trains that had been run simply to carry them to the lynching. So that was a huge ritual of extermination at which thousands of people participated. It was reported in newspapers, not only all of the United States, but literally around the world. The horror of lynching wasn't just what it did to the victims of the lynch mob, but of course what it must have done to the participants and what it did to the African American community and what it did to people who read about it. Richard Wright talks about how in his youth, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember his exact words, in his youth, it wasn't what he experienced personally that affected him most deeply about Jim Crow and white supremacy in the South. It's what he heard about secondhand. It made his imagination churn as he would hear stories of white violence. So it had to have left for African Americans a sense that at any moment their life was vulnerable. For white Southerners, it put them in the situation of having to defend these horrible, horrible murders by mobs, and one can only imagine the sort of hypocrisy or the intellectual gymnastics they had to engage in to do that. The consequences, I think, are so deeply rooted in the way in which white and black Southerners have interacted ever since that it's just fundamental to tensions between the two races in the American South and in the United States as a whole.
In the generations to come, people in the North and the South will have very different perceptions about the successes and failures of Reconstruction.
It was a success because the nation did reunite. That is an achievement in itself, despite the difficulties at every single level, great difficulties. It was a failure for African Americans. Freedom was very, very different than they had hoped and anticipated and expected. Freedom for them was living a very poor life, still dependent on the white population. Freedom for them was going to northern states or the West and encountering vicious prejudice, the same kind of prejudice that they lived in the South, knowing that their opportunities were hampered. Suffrage for black men, which they eagerly enjoyed, ended after the Republican Party left the South. So by 1900, it was a rare event for a black man to vote. So Reconstruction has to look like the Civil War in a broader perspective.
The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.